Hey there, this is Skycave Studios, and here's a time-lapse of Pokemon Greenhouse. So I started this drawing the same way I start everything else, and that is with a sketch, but I handled this one slightly differently because instead of roughly sketching everything in like I normally do, I used the perspective mode inside of Procreate to create a sort of foundation for the composition, and that will guide me as to where I can put the Pokemon when I do start the rough sketch. So my initial concept for the entire drawing was to have this greenhouse and fill it with only grass Pokemon. But what I realized was there really aren't a lot of grass Pokemon. I looked up a list, and the very few that there were, I didn't think a lot of them were iconic or classic enough to have a spot in the drawing. Or at least for me, I knew that this was going to be a nostalgic drawing, but I'm looking at this list and I wasn't even connecting with most of these Pokemon, let alone remembering who they were. So I had a change of heart. I came up with the idea of Squirtle watering Bulbasaur, but then at that point, you can't have Bulbasaur and Squirtle but not include Charmander, so I decided to switch it up a little bit and set a new rule for myself. So the new rule was any Pokemon that I like or remember is potentially allowed to possibly be included. But the bare minimum is any Pokemon I select has to at least feel like they fit into the setting, and if those Pokemon happen to be grass type, that's perfect. That being said, the ones that I did include aren't even necessarily my favorites, they're just the ones that I thought would fit really well, and there are so many that I wish I could have included, but for whatever reason I just didn't. And I think the bigger message is just that sometimes you have to change your concept, sometimes you have to let go of your initial idea for a better final result. So just be open-minded to the idea that it is totally normal and extremely common to have to scrap your initial concept for the betterment of your work. There's absolutely nothing wrong with doing that. So anyways, here I am sketching Charmander, and this was the first time that I realized something that I didn't think of. And that is that my style is different than the original Pokemon style, especially the eyes of the characters. Like, Charmander has these sort of lizard eyes, but all of the eyes that I draw are always like these beady eyes with highlights in them. And so now I'm trying to figure out how to make both styles work together. And in the end, I figured out how to make it work, and I think it actually enhanced it in my opinion, because now these eyes that I usually draw make the Pokemon look like babies. So it kind of makes them look really cute for some reason, but I don't know, maybe I should have just kept it the same. But that is one thing that I did change in terms of their design. But basically, I realized that Pokemon are so hard to draw, and I clearly did not draw them enough as a kid because I had to do a character study for every single one of them. That's why you're seeing me draw them in the center of the composition. I'm just trying to get their form right, I'm trying to get their poses right, I'm putting them on their own layer so I can shift them around to where they need to be. But one thing you don't see is that behind the scenes, I'm looking at a ton of references to make sure that everything I'm doing in the drawing looks correct. So speaking of using references, what I'm doing here is I'm bringing in a reference of Jolteon because I literally could not figure out how to draw him and make him look right. And I was so desperate that I literally opened up my Pokemon game, took a picture of my actual Jolteon and brought him in here and traced him and then tweaked his form that way because I could not figure out how to get him to look right. I don't know what it was, especially with the eyes. He has the complete opposite eyes that I'm used to drawing in my style. He has these sort of like sharp, angry looking eyes, and I gave up. I literally gave up and just had his eyes closed. And the most ironic thing about the whole Jolteon situation is he is my favorite Pokemon and I can't even draw him. So I eventually finished Jolteon, and then I continue to push forward with the rough sketch, constantly bringing in references when I need to, and then I start working on Pikachu. Now I usually put references to a bunch of different things inside of my illustrations, but in this one there's only one outside reference, and that is Pikachu holding the Mandrake, which is this disgusting, screaming plant baby thing from Harry Potter. And when I was a kid, after watching the Harry Potter movies, every time I thought of greenhouses, I always thought of mandrakes. But other than that, there are a lot of little details and sort of Easter eggs in here, like from the Pokemon universe. You have like the Master Ball in there, the rare candies, the wanted poster with Jesse and James from Team Rocket. But my favorite Easter egg that I put in this entire thing is Mew hiding inside of the pickup truck. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, this is probably the greatest Pokemon urban legend of all time. And if you played the games back in the day, you've probably heard this, but for those that haven't, in the original games, after sailing on the SS Anne, you come across this really odd island, and on the island is this one random pickup truck, and nobody really knew what the pickup truck did. But the urban legend was, if you surf and get to the pickup truck, you can find Mew hidden under it, and then you can battle him and catch him, and that's the only way to obtain Mew in the original games. Now, was any of this true? Absolutely not, but we were gullible little kids, and we believed it. And this was pre-internet, pre-fact-checking Mythbusters, like, there was none of that, so it was honestly just really impressive that all of these kids had heard about it, and you can't really blame us for not knowing that it was fake, but we got bamboozled. Other than that, there are a few more Easter eggs worth mentioning. On the left table in front of the fan is my Game Boy Color that I had as a kid, and then on the right side behind Sudowoodo is a little houseplant, and that's the actual houseplant that I have that's on my desk. And of course, there are a bunch of references to the games. You have the shiny Gyarados in the Lake of Rage behind Mew, and then you have the cable car, which is from Ruby and Sapphire, as well as Lugia and Ho-Oh in the back by the Burn Tower. And now I'm finishing my sketch, and I'm going to move on to the next phase, which is doing the line art. And so essentially what I'm going to do here is just trace the sketch with really clean lines. To make this easier for myself, what I do is I take my sketch layer and I make it red, and then I lower the transparency and just use it as a guide to trace. Now, one thing that's interesting about this drawing in particular is that while I was working on this, behind the scenes I was working on setting up my shop. So because the plan was to start selling my art, that meant I had to make things much higher quality than I did before. And so what I did was I made this one 30 by 30 inches, where all the other drawings before were 9 by 9 inches. But that meant I had to do a few things. I had to change my canvas settings, I had to change my brush settings, and I had to change the color profile that I was used to working in. So now all of these things are changing, and I'm using this drawing in particular as a sort of guinea pig for everything moving forward. And now with all of these changes, in order to make sure that this drawing stayed consistent with my older drawings, I had to do a little bit of trial and error and go back and compare and make sure the sizing of the lines looked okay, the colors translated properly since I'm working in a new profile, and everything is set up properly so it could be purchased, downloaded, or printed. But yeah, this is available in my shop if you're interested. I have digital downloads, art prints, merchandise, you name it, it's probably there. And of course, a link to that is in the video description. Anyways, back to the drawing. I'm finishing up tracing everything, getting the line art looking good, and it's a little hard to see unless you're zoomed in, but I'm also adding some stylization to it by distressing it a little bit, and I'm doing that by just taking my eraser and just going over little sections of the line art. And the result of doing this is that it kind of roughens up the entire drawing and gives it more of a retro feel. And now we're moving on to color. So I'm quickly coloring this by using a really cool feature in Procreate called Reference. If you select your layer and go to its settings, there's a little toggle that says Reference. And what this does is it allows you to fill shapes with color. So because we have a line art layer, we can take that color that we want and just drag it into the shapes that we want to fill. It's basically just a paint bucket tool with extra steps, but it's an amazing feature, and if you didn't know about it, I highly recommend looking into it because it speeds up your workflow drastically. Another tip I have for working with color is to save your colors in a palette or write them down like their hex code, because it will make it so much easier if you need to go back to that color. And believe it or not, the eyedropper tool is very unreliable if you're working with pixels. If you're working in vector, that's completely fine, but basically what happens is when you zoom in, right, you see the pixels. But if you have two colors that are close together, what happens is the pixels in the middle will blend together to compensate for the change in color. So if you eyedrop something that's close to two colors, you'll most likely get a color that is not the exact color that you're trying to get. You'll probably get a blended version of that color. And for that reason, I recommend just saving your colors and then selecting them every single time you want to use that color. And the added bonus of that is your work will look so much more consistent because you won't have like a million different versions of the same color inside of your project. And the added bonus of saving your colors is not only will your one project have a consistent color scheme, but you could take that palette and apply it to your whole universe of projects so they all have the same color scheme. And that consistency is really how you build a brand, and it just makes your work look like it all belongs in the same universe. Not to mention, this removes all of the guesswork from trying to figure out what colors to use. If I'm working with water, I don't have to guess what color blue I'm using because I can just reference the saved palette from another project. Same thing with the grass, with skin tones. It just makes it so much easier to work, and it makes you so much faster. But now that I'm done with the color, I'm moving on to working on the highlights, and I like to have my light source come from the top left corner. There's no real reason why, it's just personal preference. And I almost always make my highlights a certain color instead of just leaving them white. In this drawing, I made them a light yellow to represent that they're coming from the sun. And now I'm working on the shadows, and I pretty much handle these the same way that I do the highlights. So I'm still using the top left as the source of the light, and I'm also following the rule of using a color for my shadows as opposed to just making them black. The other thing I do with my shadows is I set the layer blending mode to the hard light option, and then I lower the opacity to 50%. The coolest thing about using the hard light blending mode and then lowering the transparency is that the colors underneath the shadows will actually react to the shadows on top of them. So this is another great way to eliminate the guesswork when it comes to working with color. I really love this step because it's the first time when you start to really see the depth instead of having something that looks more flat. I think adding the shadows is like the biggest step to the next level. So the next thing I'm doing is trying to figure out how to separate the far background, the outside portion, from the inside portion of the greenhouse. And so what I'm doing is I'm kind of creating these windows to separate those two things. I was having a little trouble figuring out how to go about this, but I figured if I made these sort of streaks on the glass, it would look like they're windows and that they would separate the background from the inside of the greenhouse. After that, I'm just adding some light streaks coming from the sky, like some God rays, just to show that there is sunlight coming into the greenhouse. It adds some life, some warmth to the whole drawing. And then other than that, we're on the last step, which is just final touches, some tweaks here and there, just really making sure everything looks okay. And then we are finally done. So looking into my Procreate settings, it says this one took 70 hours and 2 minutes to complete, and there are 67,701 total pencil strokes made. Honestly though, it was probably a little longer than that because outside of this project, I spent some time trying to figure Jolteon out, and I actually created a little animation with him, which I put at the end of this video if you stick around. But yeah, this is now available in my shop. You can hang it on your wall, put it as a phone wallpaper, throw it on a skate deck, whatever you can think of. And if you don't follow my Instagram yet, definitely check that out because that's where I post everything first. And if you want to like and subscribe, that's cool too, but really no pressure at all. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed. Here's that Jolteon animation. Have an amazing rest of your day and take care.